two, one, two, three.
Hello, and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm David Foote, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and activist here in Ithaca, New York. I'm joined today by co-host and fellow DSA member Theresa Alt. We're here to talk for a little while today with Assemblyperson Anna Kelles. Anna spent 5 years on the Tompkins County Legislature between 2015 and 2020 before being elected to represent Assembly District 125, which covers Tompkins County and part of Cortland County. So we wanted to talk with you today a little bit about the New York State budget, how that process went, how the budget was decided, and what are some of the things that it includes. You were involved with the budget talks. We were able to see a little bit of it from some of our fellow activists who are in Albany. A lot more of it went on behind closed doors. Deadlines were extended. It seemed a little bit complicated. Could you share a little bit with us about how the process went and what some of the things that you were thrilled to see included in this year's budget are?
Okay, well, so complicated to say the least. I mean, the process itself is always complicated. Um, it is over a 7,000 page budget. The process in New York State starts with the governor introducing her proposed budget, which happens typically sometime in January, although she has until I think February 1st. This was introduced around February 1st. So it was already pushed to as far out as it could go. Then legislators scramble to read as much of it as possible while simultaneously writing letters promoting their own budget priorities. They don't have to be obviously district specific, but state priorities. Like, for example, I was pushing a bill that I have been working on for years that would create operational funding for EMS services. I have a bill that works specifically on Agrovoltaics, a center, because we are going to, as climate change happens, we're going to continue to have a tension between creating renewable energy infrastructure and being able to create food.
What
Um,
what are
and
agrovoltaics?
so
Explain.
Agrovoltaics is a system that combines both agriculture and solar panels on the same field. Right now, we have a competition where it's either one or the other, and we don't really have a good system laid out. So there are cases where some farmers will have sheep grazing underneath the solar panels. Some have some beehives. Some have some herbs that they're growing, but it isn't a truly economically sustainable model for farmers. It's still sort of one or the other because there isn't enough money that is made in the agriculture associated with the current solar structures. So the bill, which was actually funded, would create a center in partnership with Cornell to bring together scientists from plant science, agriculture, engineering, and even actually sociology and psychology, because there is a lot of emotion, a lot of tension around this issue, and there's a lot of outreach that needs to happen. So they'll do the research, they'll take all the risks on figuring out best practices, how you lay out solar panels, how far they need to be, how tall, how high they need to be, what is the structures that would be necessary, the metals that would be necessary in order to have the proper height so that you could grow sufficient amounts of food underneath that's actually food, and then have autonomous tractors, because you can't really have tractors that have people on them because that's too tall. People's heads would be smacking into the solar panels. So there's a lot of technical aspects of it that need to be addressed. And it's much better that a research center, take all the risks to do all the work rather than throwing money into pilots where farmers are already overextended, strained for time, for people, workers, to have them doing a hit or miss to figure out what works in agrivoltaic technology and infrastructure isn't the best use of state money. So the idea is to create the center, do all the research, and then distribute it all throughout Cornell Cooperative Extension, as well as soil and water districts. So that was one of the things that was funded. But regardless, so the process is that we all have initiatives. We write bills for some of them, or we just straight write letters, and we circulate them amongst each other to try and get others to sign on to our initiatives. It feels a bit like the Hunger Games, and it goes on for 2 or 3 weeks. We're all collecting signatures. We're all advocating for what we would like to see in the budget. And all of those signatures, those final letters, go into central staff in both the houses, in the Senate and the Assembly. And then central staff in both the houses bring all of that together, plus what they're hearing from unions, from advocates, from all different groups. And they create from that the one house budget responses. We are, in the meantime, of course, waiting for the governor, who comes out with her 30-day amendments, which happens in March, the first week of March. And then our one houses come out in response. Now, typically, the budget legally is due March 31st. So it doesn't leave us much time then to negotiate and rectify those 3 budgets, right? Because by the time the 2 one house budgets come out, we have 3 completely different budgets that then need to be combined into one. So in March, there's a lot of haggling and fighting and negotiating and championing for all of your legislation. Most commonly, that stage, the only things that are still live are the things that made it into at least one house. So by that point, I knew that my small business innovation and research program that I have a piece of legislation for, and I've been pushing for years, made it into the Assembly one house. I had an ask for $25 million for harmful algal bloom, longitudinal analysis and research and data collection, because that is a huge environmental issue that we need to address. And that made it into the Assembly one house. And then the Agrovoltaics initiative that I was pushing for made it into the Senate one house. There were also tons of initiatives that I am a part of. So they aren't my bills per se, but I champion these initiatives like affordable housing, so the good cause legislation, the housing access voucher program. The governor had a housing compact, but it didn't explicitly require affordable housing. So in her housing compact, her proposal was to have every municipality be responsible to develop 1 to 3% of housing over a 3-year period, 1% for upstate, 3% for downstate, or to create a safe harbor during that window by repealing some of their exclusionary zoning. So there's a lot of types of exclusionary zoning that are all over New York State. We actually have some of the most antiquated exclusionary zoning that exists in the United States, exists in New York. And so her plan, which I actually agreed with, allowed for municipalities to create a safe harbor by removing some of their own exclusionary zoning practices. And they had a choice. It's important for people to remember, though, if there was a municipality that doesn't have a lot of demand for the development of housing, the housing compact really didn't apply to them, because most often if a developer is coming in to develop in that community, they're not going to reject it because it's bringing in needed housing. The problem with the whole program is that it didn't explicitly require affordable housing. It was actually modeled partly after a bill that I carry with Senator Rachel May, which explicitly requires affordable housing. The governor wasn't really interested in doing any of the tenant protections that a lot of us progressive legislators wanted. And there were a lot of people that didn't really understand the housing compact. So I don't think we had as robust a conversation about it as we could have had. And I really do hope that we come back. Part of the issue, I think, is that and I hope that the governor does this moving forward, is actually having a lot of open conversations with municipal governments so that they feel a sense of buy-in. And then we can come back and have another round of conversations about some robust housing changes. Last year, she tried the same thing with the accessory dwelling units bill that she had put into last year's budget that she pulled in the 30-day amendment that I was in support of. It's actually a bill by my colleague, Assemblymember Harvey Epstein, that I actually think was really important, and it would have created equity in housing, which is something that we deeply need. We're one of the most unaffordable states in the country with respect to housing, and it does make living in New York State very difficult. So all of those negotiations were happening in March. What has been very difficult for this session is that the whole budget was actually held up by a very heated debate on bail reform. As you may know, we've had an annual argument about bail reform, and the governor was pushing very hard to do another round of bail reform rollbacks and discovery reform rollbacks. I myself was not a supporter of that, as you would expect. I actually voted against that section of the budget ultimately because there were some rollbacks that I felt were very unnecessary and misguided. I will say just very briefly about bail reform. The bail reform laws went into place in 2019, and the purpose of it was to recognize that there was profound inequities in how bail was being implemented. So you could have two people who commit the same exact crime. One person has enough money to pay for bail, and they're able to get out and wait trial in the community. And someone who is poor, who is convicted, or not convicted, but who's charged with the same crime, waits in jail because they simply can't afford the bail. That bails are often not set based on a person's ability to pay. And so it ultimately ended up being deeply inequitable, where more often Black and brown people end up being the people most likely to be incarcerated pretrial. So if you look at most jails across the state, a majority of people, up to, in some cases, 75% of people who are in jails are pretrial. And we are a country of innocent until proven guilty, and people who are in, the number one reason that they're there pretrial is because they couldn't afford bail. There are certainly people who are there who bail that for which bail was not set because the charge was too high of a crime. But those aren't the people that we're talking about. We're talking about the people that were in fact bail eligible, meaning that if they had the bail money, they could get out pre-trial. Why this is important, of course, is because when you send someone into jail pre-trial, you are separating them from their community. They lose their job, they lose their housing, they lose their connections. And then what if they go through the trial and they're exonerated? They could have sat in jail for years. So even if they are exonerated, they still have lost all their connections and all their infrastructure and have to start over again. And there are people who sit in jail and sit in prison for years pre-trial, which is another whole conversation. And the last thing, of course, that's really important is that when we looked at the data after bail reform was passed, so from 2019 up until the present, we had a presentation by the Department, DCJS, the Department of Criminal Justice Services. It's a state department. They do the data collection on the criminal justice system, and they found their own data, their own presentation to the state legislature, and they showed that since 2009, the re-arrest rates went down. That is the most significant piece of information. That shows that bail reform was working. Bail is supposed to be used to ensure that someone comes back to court for their trial. It should not be used as a punishment in and of itself. So the data showed that it was working. I'll just end by saying those of us who study the science and saw that it was working were and are concerned because it was being used politically for the last couple of years, and it was one of the main reasons that a lot of the Democrats lost their seats in this last election, as the excuse or the reason for the increase in crime that we've seen over the last couple of years. But anyone who studies science at all and is an epidemiologist, I'm very particular about this, the biggest cause of the increase in crime, which we have had over the last couple of years, is COVID. What has COVID caused? It has caused social isolation. It has caused economic destabilization. It has caused loss of stable housing, increase in mental health issues, increase in domestic violence, right? All of these things that we know are highly correlated with crime. So we're fixing the wrong problem. We're fixing something that isn't a problem.
Yeah, and I remember seeing that that this increase in crime happened everywhere in the country.
Not only did it happen everywhere in the country, but it happened to the rate increase in New York State was lower than the national average. So again, as a scientist, you would create a hypothesis, of course, that would say, well, there was something in New York State that was protective. What is the series of things that we changed in New York that didn't change anywhere else? And one of those things was bail reform. So you could form the hypothesis that it was actually protective. You could. It would have been a great hypothesis to test. Of course, we didn't. It was left to politics, and it was a political decision, not a policy decision. So that was the reason that I voted against that section of the budget, because it's very concerning, and I think it was the wrong decision. We did thankfully fight back the rollbacks of discovery reform. I thought that was a really successful part of this budget. Some of the highlights of this budget, even though it was 5 weeks late because of the bail reform debate, we did succeed in getting, I think, some really amazing things in the budget. One of the biggest areas for me was education. So the education budget that we approved, K through 12, is $34 billion to general support for public schools. I said $34 billion. So that was an increase of $3 billion, or almost 10% over last year's budget. There were a couple pieces of this that were particularly important. The total amount also that went to foundation aid was $24 billion. And this is the first time, $2.6 billion increase. This is the first time since 2007 that foundation aid was fully funded. And for anybody who doesn't know what foundation aid is, there was a lawsuit against the state that was won. And in 2007, the state was required to equalize funding to schools between those that were very high income schools to very low income schools, right? Because schools, a heavy, majority of what schools get is property tax. If you have a very wealthy district, you would have a lot more funding going to that school than you would to a poor school, low-income community, and a school in that low-income community. So, of course, you then would have significantly fewer services if you were in a lower-income community. That is not equitable. So foundation aid was designed to create a balance of funding specifically between the lower-income schools and the higher-income school districts. That has not been fully funded since its inception in 2007. So 3 years ago, the governor promised to fully fund foundation aid over the next 3 years. And this new governor stayed firm with that commitment, thankfully. And we did complete the full amount of the foundation aid. Now, the next battle will be that we actually update the foundation aid formula itself, because it's still based on, I think, 2000 census. And, we've moved around a lot over the last 20 years. So that's the next big fight. But that was huge, $2.6 billion. And we had several billion dollars put in last year. The plan also included $150 million in new funding for universal pre-kindergarten programs. And that will significantly expand the reach of pre-K throughout the state. The spending plan also included $134.6 million to help provide full reimbursement for school meals to districts that can participate in the federal community eligibility provision. That's the CEP program. So although this doesn't create what we were hoping for, which was the full universal school meals, which would have cost somewhere between 200 and I think 250 million. We did put almost 135 million. So it is a huge step in this right direction, which will expand the number of kids that will get free meals in schools by about 300,000 more kids. The important thing is that this is in combination with what we're hoping to happen at the federal level, which is a plan that they are reviewing that would reduce the percentage of students required in a given school to be receiving free lunch from 40% to 25% for that school to qualify to participate in the CEP program. So right now, a school or school district needs to have 40% of their students receiving free or reduced lunch in order for that school or school district to be eligible for this CEP program. If they reduce that to only 25% of the students, and simultaneously we've increased the amount of funding to all of those students to pay the gap between what they get from the federal and what they will get from the state. Prior, there really wasn't any state funding. It will cover most of the state, which is huge. Because anybody who has studied nutrition, of course, you all know that my PhD is in nutrition, that this period of time, I mean, the most critical is 0 to 3, because that's when the brain is the most of the synaptic development and connections are happening in the brain. But of course, the brain is still malleable and growing and developing, all the way, in fact, until 25. So if we get, those really formative years and we are ensuring that they have sufficient nutrition, we're setting all of our children up, to reach their maximum cognitive development potential throughout their lives. And that's so hugely important. So this is something we'll continue to fight for. The budget also included just under 60 million for early college, high school, and pathways in technology. That's the P-TECH program. And this was a $20 million increase above last year's budget. So this program allows students to earn college credit and even in some cases, associate's degree by the time they graduate high school. And that is huge because a lot of people are realizing college is not the only path to success. There are so many programs now that simply need technical skills. Like, for example, there's 9,000 jobs for the, Micron factory that for the microchips for electric cars and, to electrify so many of our systems that's being developed and will open outside of Syracuse. They need technical skills. So in our district, TC3 is working on programs, specifically micro-credentials and training that provide specifically those skill sets so that people will right away be eligible for jobs. And specifically, families that don't have the money to send kids all the way through college, this sets them up for success. The P-TECH program is really important. There was $112 million of funding for private schools for the blind and deaf, and something near and dear to my heart as someone who spent my entire life legally blind. 9.3 million for adult literacy education, 13 million for the Consortium for Workers Education, and there was almost 500,000 for bilingual teacher training. I'm sorry, 400,000. So I think education was one of the biggest areas of success. There were other smaller programs that I think are really important. My Brother's Keeper program, they got 144 million in funding since the program's inception. But this year's budget included 18 million in ongoing funding for the program, which is hugely important that it was ongoing funding. And the last thing, again, that was really important is that there was almost 100 million in aid to public libraries. So that's like, I think the biggest win in the budget is education.
Maybe we could take a few minutes to talk about what's next, what's left, because we said that a lot of things were not covered in the budget.
Yeah.
But is there any more time in the session when legislation can be done?
Right. Well, so there's some things that were done, but I think need more work. We did raise the minimum wage and we indexed it, but we didn't raise it to what we were fighting for. So we're going to have to keep fighting to raise the minimum wage. But the fact that it is indexed now is huge. We did fight really hard for money for nursing homes. They need to have their Medicaid reimbursement rate increased. We got about 40% of what they needed. I'm hugely concerned that some of them will be closing. A lot of them will be closing across the state. That is something we're going to have to revisit, but we won't be able to do that until next year. We did get $500 million towards workforce retention grant program for childcare, and we got $25 million to support employee child tax credits. And that sounds like a lot, but it is nowhere near enough, particularly for our district. Yeah. There are so many families that have left work because they cannot afford childcare. And we right now in our district have childcare slots sufficient for only a third of kids under 6 years old. We have one of the greatest childcare deserts in the state in our county. Housing, was a bit of a disaster in this budget. I was very frustrated about it. We are going to have to come back. There are those of us who are fighting really hard to get good cause, because that will create, people don't understand it. They think it's an anti-eviction bill. I would say a lot of people, in the landlord and, real estate world talk about it as another, eviction bill. It is not. It is an anti-gentrification bill. What's happening is, and in fact, actually a pro-small landlord bill, if you really understand it, because with no cap whatsoever on how much people can increase rent, what's happening is that it is incentivizing private equity firms in buying up real estate throughout all of New York State, particularly in tight housing markets like Ithaca. In our district, the city of Ithaca is one of the most expensive places to live in the state and even in the country. So, it is a place where private equity firms are coming in. In New York City, it's huge. Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Albany, all of the big cities. And if we put a cap on how much in any 1 year they can increase rent, then it takes away the incentive of this endless amount of rent increases that landlords can demand at the end of a lease.
And for that matter, another thing that a lot of us are very concerned about is car share.
My bill.
Well, thank you, Anna, for sharing all of this with us. And this has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm host David Foote with co-host Theresa Alt, joined today by guest, our assembly person, Anna Kelles. Anna, thank you for sharing.